Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Conserving Pollinators on Small-Scale Farms. I'm Haley Nelson, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. I'll begin by first explaining the agenda. Dr. Donald Lewis is here with us right now. You can see him on camera. Hi, Dr. Lewis. He's from Iowa State University, and will begin by presenting his segment of the presentation, and then he'll be followed by Dr. Laura Jesse of Iowa State University. When their presentations are finished, we'll have a question and answer session in which you as the participants can ask questions that you have, and they will be answered by our question and answer panel tonight. Our Q&A panel for this webinar consists of Dr. Laura Jesse and Dr. Donald Lewis from Iowa State University, and then Dr. Rick Besson is also here with us from University of Kentucky, and then also Dr. Shelby Fleischer of Penn State University. When our question and answer session is completed, I will go ahead and close the webinar. Donald and Laura, I'll go ahead and turn off my cameras and audio, and you can get started.
Okay, we're going to go to a full screen mode here so that you can see the slides, I think. There we go, that's what we wanted to show you. And hello everybody, and welcome to the OREI and the SARE. These are government programs that have funded research that we are presenting in this series of webinars. And tonight's program is on conserving pollinators, especially on small-scale farms. I'll have the first half, and then Laura Jesse will come in to talk about preserving and protecting pollinators, and then as Haley has described, we will take your questions and answers. First, we're going to start though with the importance and the decline and the identification of pollinators, especially as it relates to cucurbits. Pollinators are incredibly important to agricultural production. We guess $20 to $30 billion a year from the environmental service that pollinators provide us. And some people estimate that that's 1/3 of all the food and beverages that we consume. Honeybees are, of course, the workhorses of the pollinator industry, especially where we try to manage and manipulate the pollinators. Honeybees can be confined like livestock. We can box them up, we can move them, we can put them where the pollinator numbers are low. We can accomplish what pollination we need, and then we can take those pollinators back out. Another advantage of using honeybees is that honeybee workers will recruit more workers from their hive to come work the crop that they are working. And finally, honeybees have something called floral constancy, where once they find a food source, they will continue to use that food source even if there are other food sources available. So they will continue to come to the crop that we want pollinated, and that's why we like honeybees for pollinator services. But not all pollinators are honeybees, the European honeybee. Honeybees are social bees, and another pollinator that is in that category are the bumblebees. Social bees are those that have a division of labor where you have a queen that does the reproduction, you have workers that gather the food and take care of the offspring, and you have males, the drones, that wait around for a chance to mate with new queens. Another characteristic of the social bees is that there's an overlap of generations, and there is communal care, that is, the colony is taking care of the offspring. This is in contrast to solitary bees, one of our other pollinators, where each female builds a nest and each female is capable of laying eggs, and she does this without the assistance, without the help of any workers. We guess there's about 4,000 species of these in the United States, and if you're wondering what these look like or what these might consist of, if you think of what you grew up calling sweat bees, that's the type of bee we're talking about. Generally small, often brightly colored, and we'll go through a few of those as we go along. Regardless of the type of bee we're talking about, entomologists like to remind you of the life cycle, and in order to propagate more bees, we must go through this life cycle you see across the top of the page. Eggs are laid by the adult female. Those hatch into larvae that have to be fed or cared for, or they have to eat food that was provisioned by the female. The larva goes into a pupa stage where the individual insect digests itself, transforms itself into the adult stage. Males and females mate, and we start that cycle over. The picture shows how that would look in a solitary bee, going from an adult female laying eggs in a nest in the ground, that egg hatching into a larva that develops through pupa and back to the adult stage. As we talk about cucurbits, we know pollination is incredibly important, that we need lots and lots of bee visits to accomplish pollination. Each muskmelon contains up to 600 or more seeds, and every seed must have a pollen grain in order to develop. And those pollen grains are brought to the flowers by lots and lots of visits by the bees that are gathering nectar and pollen for their own use, and as a side benefit to us, transferring the pollen from one flower to another and accomplishing pollination. One of the research projects that we have been involved with in the 3 states that were mentioned earlier is to examine what bees are already out there in cucurbit fields, a little information on are they pollinating the crop, and then do we have pollination limitation, and if we did, could we increase the amount of pollination that's out there? So those are the questions that we'll answer here in the next few moments of our prepared presentation. As I mentioned, 3 states have been involved with this, Iowa, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania, and it's been our pleasure to work with outstanding entomologists and horticulturists and plant pathologists from the other states as we accomplish research on farms and on our research farms to try to answer the questions we just mentioned. So our first question, what pollinators are present? And we've had cucurbit fields throughout those 3 states where we have gone out and sampled bees in a variety of methods to find who is out there and also who's doing the work of pollination that's necessary for the crop. So all 3 states have been conducting this research. Here's some research results from Kentucky, where in a field that they examined for pollinators, they found 37 different species of pollinators out there. The names aren't terribly important, and it's a long list of names that are hard to pronounce and don't mean a lot to us. Just notice the variety, though, the incredible number of different species that are already out there, that are already present in these fields where the research was being done. Here is a graph from 8 different farm fields in Iowa where we collected bees by 2 different methods. The small black bar are bees that were collected in the flowers using that little gadget at the top, which is called a bee vac. It's a modified dust buster that sucks the bees out of the flowers as the researchers walk through and examine the flowers, usually early in the morning. The tan-colored line are bees that were collected by bee bowls. These are just colored plastic bowls filled with water and soap that sit there among the foliage. The bees are attracted to those colors, they fall in, and that's how we sample them. The third line, the orange line, is the combination of both of those added together, and the number of species that we found on farms we visited varied from 36 to 54 different species of bees. Who are these major pollinators that are out there? Well, of course, the top left, the honeybee, shows up in all of our fields, and often it's because we have put them there or because there are wild bees of the European honeybee species in the area. But we've also found lots of other bees, and these are the solitary bees or the native pollinators that we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. One of the most important pollinators, one of the most important native bees that we have found, is a specialist on squash and pumpkin called the squash bee. This one is solitary, so each female produces offspring. There's 1 generation per year. And what we've discovered is that that female is very active in the morning when the flowers are first open, and then she spends her night down in a hole in the ground where she has nested. Males are also in the flowers, and they hide in the flowers in the middle of the day. And that's one way to sample for them, is to look at the wilted flowers, and the squash bee will be hiding inside. Adults begin to emerge from their underground burrows in July. They're present for 2 to 3 weeks before the female begins to dig and provision a nest with nectar and pollen. Then she lays her eggs. Her larvae feed on that pollen, and then they overwinter underground as pre-pupae. It's the females provisioning the nests with pollen from nectar, pollen and nectar from squash and pumpkins. That's the benefit to us. The benefit to the bee is that her offspring have that provision as food to grow and develop. Bumblebees, of course, are out there in the fields also. They nest in abandoned burrows or in other cavities in the ground. You can buy commercially produced bumblebees if you want to. Bumblebees are generalists. They will visit lots of different flowers around the farm. There's a small group of metallic blue or black bees that are called the mason bees, and these make nests that are sealed shut with mud. Hence, they're like masons. They work with a plaster-like material, and that's how they got their name. They do nest in galleries, often in pithy stems or in soda straws. We can make them nest in artificial placements. There are solitary, but they often nest lots of them in one small area. Another important bee that we've discovered is the longhorn bee. It's an all-black fuzzy bee that has very hairy hind legs, great for picking up pollen from moving it from flower to flower. Named the longhorn bees because of the long antennae that are on the female. These also nest in the ground, and one of the most important is a specific longhorn bee called the two-spotted longhorn bee because of the white spots on the side of the body. And then finally, we mentioned sweat bees. There are 3 different groups that are called sweat bees, from small to medium, brown or metallic. Some of them are bronzy or golden metallic in color. Most of these are solitary. They will produce several generations per year. They are also nesting in the soil, some of them in soft wood. They're generalists and will visit lots of flowers as well. So you've seen pictures of these solitary bees as we've gone along and talked about the different kinds. Another question is, are they pollinating the crop? We know they're out there. We have seen the bees in the flowers as you see in these different pictures. Here are some observations from Kentucky in a squash and pumpkin patch where bumblebee, the first bar, and that squash bee, the second bar, and the honeybee, the third bar, and then the black bee that we talked about, the fourth bar, are major pollinators that were collected inside the flowers. Here's another bit of data from Penn State, Pennsylvania farms, where they found bumblebees in 60% of the pumpkin flowers, squash bees in about 30%, and then honeybees in 9%. So these are observations made of the flowers to see which bees are there so that we know they are visiting, they are accomplishing pollination. One more example of the observations from a muskmelon field in Kentucky. Here it's honeybee was the most commonly visited, commonly seen while looking at the flowers, followed by bumblebees, that small black bee, that one called green halictid. That's one of those sweat bees that we were mentioning. So these bees are out there. We know they are doing pollination. We know our crops are getting pollinated because they're growing, they're developing, and they are full of seeds. I'm going to turn the chair and the microphone over to Dr. Jesse to answer the question, can we increase pollination?
Hello, everyone. Adjust the camera down just a tad here. So, you know, as Dr. Don Lewis was saying, there's a lot of different species out there. We know there's a lot of different bee species. So kind of the next question is can we increase pollination? Can we use flowers and other means to possibly increase the number of pollinators out there pollinating the crop? And one of the ways that we can really increase the number of pollinators there is by increasing the diversity of flowers. So pollinators need pollen and nectar, and so increasing that available pollen and nectar is not only available to the pollinators, but also, although this wasn't part of our research, it's important to keep in mind that the natural enemies, lady beetles, you know, very important predators that feed on aphids and other pests, require pollen as a great nutrient source. Parasitic wasps, you can see the picture there. The larvae are the ones that are inside the aphids or the caterpillars, but actually the adult female wasps and male wasps need pollen and nectar to feed on. So these increasing the diversity of other flowering plants not only benefits pollinators, it also benefits natural enemies, although tonight we're focusing just on the pollinators. So one of the ways we call to increase the diversity is called floral resource provisioning, or we tend to shorten it to floral provisioning. And that just basically is kind of a fancy way to say that we're supplementing the landscape with flowering plants to provide food for the pollinators. So when I say floral provisioning, that just kind of means planting more flowers. And when we consider floral provisioning, there'll be different lists for the different states depending on where you're at, things that will work best on your individual farms and the habitat. But what we're generally looking for is nice, showy flowers with good amounts of pollen and nectar, things like bee balms, the clover, the Virginia mountain mint. The mints are good. The butterfly milkweed, Culver's roots, boneset, foxglove, coneflower, New England aster, sweet alyssum. So these are ones that will commonly come up on as good floral provisioning species of plants. But go ahead, for your local area, there's plenty of lists out there available, and you can certainly chat and ask us about it as well. So we did put these floral provisioning plots in each of the 3 different states, and this is just some of the data looking here in Iowa, central Iowa, at the horticulture farm, and how many different bee species were observed. And we observed 47 different species. You can see the long list there and how many of them were observed. And so the most abundant species, again, were the honeybee, the squash bee, and bumblebees. So lots of different species, again, kind of what we would expect, similar to what we had seen prior with the bee bowl and bee vac experiments. And this is kind of a busy chart here, so I will go through it for you, we'll walk through this. So there on the left side, you can see the different bee species. And then on the right side, you can see the plants that we were using in the floral provisioning. So all these different plants here and some pictures and names. And then here were their crops. So we had our melon, and this was just a melon control, melon that had the floral provisioning, squash control, and squash that we had the floral provisioning. So here's our 2 crop sorts that we're interested in, and then all the different pollinators. So what I want you to observe is that some pollinators, like here, this is a bumblebee species, the different bumblebee species, they go to lots of different plants. You can see there's quite a few went to the coneflower. They really like the Culver's root. So you can kind of see the width of the bar there says how many times it was observed going there. So that's why you see so many honeybees and so many bumblebees, because they were so common. And you can also see that the bumblebees really went down and fed on the squash as well. And here the squash bee. So this is the interesting one. This is the squash bee, the species that's very specific just onto our squash plants, and not melon, just squash. And so you can see the bars going there to the squash plants. So I want you to, the take home from this is that we have lots of different pollinators, we have lots of different flowers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all these pollinators are coming to our squash or our melons. It still tends to be a handful of species that are heavily pollinating it, and it's never as simple. It sounds great, just increase the diversity of flowers and yet increase pollination. That's not, you can't quite make that connection. You increase the diversity of flowers and you can increase the diversity of pollinators, but whether or not that at least here, you don't see a ton more of the different pollinators coming to the squash, to the melon. They're still pretty heavily visited by the big ones, the honeybee, the bumblebee, and the squash bee. And I can come back to that one because that one is hard for me to go through. So if anyone wants us to come back at the end and go through that again. And here, this figure just kind of shows, as we think about floral provisioning, one of the things is important is to have blooming flowers available kind of throughout the growing season. So even though our crop is only pollinating a certain time of the year, those pollinators need food all the time. And if you want them in the habitat, you have flowers there. And so this is kind of to show you a bit that, all this is kind of blurry. These are kind of the bumblebees, the honeybee. But what you can see in general is that in the beginning of the season, May, June, most of the populations are lower. And then as you move through the season, populations tend to build up and you have more workers and more bees out there. So that's kind of nice for our, pumpkin, mid-July and later crops that need to be pollinated, because there's generally plenty of the native pollinators out there at that time. So when you're considering floral provisioning, there's a few things to keep in mind. It's nice to use a local plant source if possible. Remember that you're going to need that bloom all summer, so you want to select several different plant species that are going to bloom at different parts of the summer. And usually in general, we say, about at least kind of 3 different species early summer, 3 species midsummer, and 3 species late summer. Always keep in mind to stick to non-aggressive species. You don't want to be fighting your floral provisioning plot. And you also want to consider a variety of different flower shapes and colors. So as you saw in that, kind of spider web figure, the bees like different things, and different species of bees like different flowers. So the more variety you have, the more chances you have something that will make your pollinators happy. And it's also nice to have kind of a clump of each type. You don't want just kind of one flower, or one plant of a certain type of flower. It's nice to have, a clump of several different plants, or several of the plants there in a clump. So the bees can find it, but it's easier for them to find the plant and the flowers they like if there's a larger clump of it. And when you're thinking about establishing this flower area, remember you're going to need an area with full sunlight. Most of these flowering plants will do best. So if it's partial shade, they just won't do as well. And you're also going to need a dedicated area for the plants. And that's the big thing, and it can be a big problem if you have some sort of rotation with your muskmelon or squash fields. Is this plot needs to be kind of a dedicated area, because really the perennial plants work best. And the seeds will take longer to establish, but seeds, of course, are much cheaper. But most of these perennial plants, in order to get established, vernalize, have good, root growth, and then flowering, it can take 2 to 3 years before you're getting really good flower production. So it is quite a lot of investment as far as time, and then investment as far as a land area that you can keep in flowers, and you're not going to need to rotate into it or need to, move equipment around in those areas and things like that. So those are things to keep in mind. The next thing that we can really do to protect the pollinators in the habitat, we could do the floral provisioning if that works well on your farm. But the other thing that we can always in general do is protect those bee nesting sites. And so in order to do that, we kind of need to know where the bees are nesting. And many of them are ground nesters. So a lot of those solitary bees that Dr. Lewis talked about in the beginning, they make these kind of tiny little burrows like this. That opening might be the size of a dime or so, and they'll have a little, pile of dirt around it. And that's what the female is going in and out of all day long, provisioning those cells with pollen and things like that. You don't tend to see much activity, but you'll see that hole there like that. And each female, most of these species, each female will build her own burrow, but oftentimes we find that the nests are clustered. So although they're solitary, once they find a nice area, they do tend to have a cluster of nests just like this. And they do tend to prefer kind of sandy areas and open areas. The bumblebees also can sometimes be in the ground. They tend to prefer like old rodent burrows and things like that, but also leaf litter and compost area. This pictured here is just a small bumblebee colony that was in a compost. So bumblebees make kind of small colonies. You might get up to 20 or 30 individuals by the end of the season. So in order to protect these nesting sites, we really want to avoid tilling fallow areas, especially those open sandy ones. And think about the fact that these are going to be there all year long and into the spring, because there will be the pupa or pre-pupa in the soil over the winter. It's also nice to leave undisturbed leaf litter or compost. And people are always kind of discovering bumblebee nests and things as they're trying to move compost, and they really cannot be moved. We get these phone calls a lot, and unfortunately it just does not work well to try to pick them up and move those nests. Old tree stumps are great nest habitat, and also, just fallow brush piles are great bee habitat. So now you can tell everyone that's not your brush pile, it's your bee pile. And the last thing you can really do to protect pollinators is reducing that pesticide exposure. Foraging bees are exposed to many different insecticides and fungicides, and obviously insecticides kill insects, and bees are insects, so they can really cause lethal or sublethal effects. So really what you can do, use less toxic products when available, and there's plenty of information on, what's less toxic to pollinating insects. Use products with a short residual life, and also avoid tank mixing with fungicides. There's more information out there showing that fungicides can also have a negative impact on pollinators, oftentimes by reducing immune response. And sometimes the chemicals, the mix of the fungicide and insecticides, can be more toxic than alone. You want to avoid the formulations that have very long residual, microencapsulated dust, sweatable powders, and those formulations. And also remember that even the organic insecticides, such as Entrust, can also be harmful to bees. So organic just does not mean that it's not harmful to bees. You want to treat in the evening when the bees are not active. If you've heard before, sometimes they'll say evening, early morning, but in the case of squash bees, they're active very, very early in the morning. So in the case of squash, you definitely want to isolate. So the evening is best. Always avoid spraying plants that are in bloom. And remember that bees can be exposed to systemic insecticides applied prior to flowering. So the neonicotinoids, primarily the imidacloprid. And you also want to avoid drift onto other flowering plants, weeds if you got a floral provisioning plot, or nesting areas as best as you can. So kind of the take home from all this is pollinators are really necessary, and as we know from the news, they're really facing increasing challenges. Floral provisioning and habitat management may help the pollinators, also the natural enemies. So we might get more species, and it's definitely beneficial. But kind of the question, will it increase yield, quality, profit? Those benefits are kind of hard to measure and uncertain. The native bees are specialists. They're active at specific times and on specific flowers. We know that the native bees are already present. We also know that small actions, like protecting nesting habitat and reducing pesticide use as best you can preserve and protect and increase these beneficial insects, and also that the biodiversity is essential to the ecosystem. So that's what we have in a nutshell, pretty rapid fire covering of like a lot of different things. So any questions?
Okay, here we've got one from Cheryl Frank. She's asking, can you show the slide of the flowering plants again? There you go. There, is that it, Cheryl? Yes.
Yes. Yes, and one of the important things is plants adapted to your area will work best. And in general, well, and the other entomologists can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've read is in general 3 different species early season, 3 different species mid, and 3 different species late kind of hedges your bets a bit. And I don't know offhand the flowering times of these. But we chose them for this experiment because the blooming year long.
Okay, we have a question from Sean now. He wants to study some of the graphs in the presentation, and he's asking where we can find them. Sean, I'll actually be posting a recording of this webinar online, and I will share the URLs to where those will be posted with everybody that has been in the sessions and who was invited to these. Otherwise, Laura, is there another way that we could possibly share the PowerPoint with people, or is there another site that they can find similar information at?
I think and I'll speak for the other states and someone can pipe up, I'm happy to email this presentation. I believe when you're posting it, you're posting all of our contact information as well, and that should include our email. So go ahead and send us an email, and we're happy to email it to you as well, if that works better.
Any other questions from participants? Celeste is asking, if you are to put pollinators under row covers, which ones are best?
So we've kind of done a little bit with row covers, and if you saw the talk last week, row covers, especially, we've done most of our work with muskmelon, but some of the other states have done other crops. It's just kind of like a remake cover over top of the row. And what we kind of looked at is if you could open the ends at the time of flowering or put pollinators under. We did some work with bumblebees just because they're fairly easy. You can get a box and you can kind of set the box at the end. We did not see increase in yield or fruit production from that over just opening up the row ends. But the bumblebees work well, that we didn't have problems with overheating or anything like that, which was one of the things we were concerned about. I don't know if anyone's tried honeybees, but I think you could do something. But it's really only bumblebees or honeybees, because those are really the only two ones that we can manipulate and put where we want to. Other yeah, Rick Shelby, you can pipe in too.
Oh.
This is Rick here. Oh, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Rick.
Yeah, we've put Pepinapis, the squash bee, under row covers, both with squash and melons. It's a specialist on squash and pumpkins, but when we put it under row covers and didn't let it access anything else, it actually would pollinate melons underneath there. And the only reason why we'd be interested in doing that is in organic systems where we never remove the row cover, and can use the row cover as season-long insect control and eliminate sprays.
Wow,
Go ahead.
Sorry, were they nesting under there as well then?
Yeah, they were. And I haven't seen the results. My graduate student, Logan Minter, went back the following year to look at emergence following some tillage regimes, and I haven't seen that data yet. He also did a little bit with Melisodes bimaculata, that black longhorn bee with the 2 spots, and that would also pollinate under a row cover. Basically, with the Pepinapis, early in the season, he would catch the males and females sleeping in the flowers and would just pluck off flowers on some sentinel plants and toss them underneath the row cover. And we found that both the males and the females do a pretty good job pollinating.
It's really interesting.
I have another question here from Cheryl Frank, and I'm having a hard time multitasking, so please forgive me if I ask a question that has already been answered. She says, didn't Dr. Besson discover that the ground nesting bees, especially squash bees, just show up under row covers?
Not necessarily. The only reason why they would show up underneath row covers is if that was an area where you had nests from the previous year. So and it's not necessarily squash or pumpkin fields, they can nest outside the fields. But if you had relatively undisturbed ground that already had the nests from the previous season that you covered with the row covers, you could get them emerge underneath the row covers. They're really not going to dig down and tunnel underneath to get into the row cover, though.
Okay, we've got another question from Erica. Were there any yield differences in muskmelon or squash with and without floral provisioning?
I don't recall any differences.
She says yield differences as in number or weight or quality of fruit.
I can say from Kentucky, we did a number of measurements on that. We were measuring, we had some 6-row plots that were either with floral provisioning or without, and we looked at yield, we looked at seed number, and we did not detect any differences between the floral provisioning and the non-floral provisioning. We're not sure that either of those plots were really in a pollinator deficit mode before that, though.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, go ahead. Do you have something else?
Yeah, that was similar to Iowa, but again, we were in similar locations, like the horticulture farm that probably didn't have a deficit to start with.
Yeah, and I'll just chip in from Pennsylvania. Pretty much the same result here in Pennsylvania. We had a hard time seeing a boost in yield or seed number. If you do some complicated statistics, you might be able to pull out slight differences, but overall, nothing substantial.
Okay, I have another question unless there's any additions. Okay, Celeste has asked, do squash bees use the same nests for more than 1 year?
No, I believe they do make new nests.
As far as we know. What do you think, Rick?
I don't know.
I've never heard of them using the same nest. I have heard of them using the same communal area, and there was one person in New York who managed to get a bunch of females nesting in one area, and they seemed to come back to that general area. It was part of a lawn, but she's the only one I know that's ever seen that.
And I would sort of agree with Shelby that I think it could be very likely that they would use the same communal area, because it's not just random places where they put these nests. There's probably some characteristics in terms of being well drained, good sun exposure, not too much plant cover in these locations where they're choosing for nests. And so some of those characteristics may be consistent from year to year and increase them using similar areas.
I think it's important for everyone listening to realize we probably don't know that much about the nesting habits of these pollinators, and the wild pollinators in general. We know a lot less than the honeybees. We know a little bit more about bumblebees, but among the things we do know about them, the nesting information is probably of the lowest quality right now in our science. How deep are the nests? Is tillage lethal? So I'm going to go by information that Dr. James Kane gave me when I asked him that question. He's at the USDA ARS lab in Logan, Utah. Of course, it's going to vary. I think there's only 1 or 2 studies that I'm aware of, and that was in California, and they went down 8, 12, 15, 18 inches. I read that, and I'm thinking, like, that's not going to happen here in Pennsylvania. We're going to hit rock by that time, and yet we have a lot of squash bees. Is tillage lethal? People are still struggling with that question. One good idea, of course, is if you have some idea of where they're nesting, either don't till that area or till it very, very shallowly, and that should work. Another possibility is if you can delay tillage until the overwintering adults will have emerged, and that'll probably be in Pennsylvania, that could be into July, so I don't know if that's a possibility. Deep tillage, I think, will be lethal. That's the best answer I can give right now. Anybody else have some ideas?
We agree.
Where we went back with squash, following squash, we tilled down to about 8 inches, and we put row covers over some of those plots. And we did have some squash bees emerge from underneath the row covers from about an 8-inch tillage. What we don't know is how many would have emerged if we didn't disturb the soil.
Speaking of tillage, one thing that some growers here are experimenting with, I think of tillage, and we've got a lot of no-till. And we have a lot of no-till pumpkins in Pennsylvania. And some growers are experimenting with in their cover crop that they're going to use for their no-till. They're putting in some crimson clover, some hairy vetch, and they're basically trying to get that. They'll plant that cover crop, and then instead of no-tilling the entire cover crop and planting their pumpkins into it, they'll leave a strip on one side. We're trying that this year. We're hoping that that'll provide some kind of floral provisioning with the pumpkin crop, and it does have the advantage of being close by the pumpkin crop in our settings where these pumpkin crops are scattered across the landscape, and they move because they rotate them from different parts of the environment.
Okay, do we have any more comments on that, or to our participants, do you have any more questions? I'll give you a few seconds to submit those still. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions popping up here. We'll go ahead and close out the webinar. Thanks, everyone, for your time. I guess have a good night, and we'll see you again for other webinars.
Thanks, everyone.